going to ask Felicity and the Minister to stand a little uncomfortably at the front here. We don't have chairs for them, but then you can see them better this way anyway. And I'm wondering whether you have any questions for them, and in particular, to think about what's on your mind. What would you like to know from them? I'm already getting hands, so I'll pass here first, then second.
Hi, thanks for talking. I'm just interested to know what's motivating you to pass the finding to be tabled in government eventually from us. Why is this the first jury that you're willing to step back and say, okay guys, you take it? Is it because it's such an emotive issue and you don't want to be the one?
Right behind.
Yes, thank you, Felicity. Felicity, by the way, is one of those people I've warned you about in my speech, about who's already got a made-up position and has all the ammunition
I'm open about it.
behind
I'm
her.
hiding it from you.
Absolutely, and it's a rational point of view. But she also then gave you some of the counter views about, well, is desexing going to be too expensive? Does that mean that people living in low socioeconomic areas of the state won't be able to afford to have a pet? So those are the issues I'd like you to grapple with. In terms of your question, sir, I should make it clear, we always table reports from citizens during Parliament. This is the first time, however, we've actually asked a verdict on a particular question. And that is because it is a very motive question. As I said, we've tabled a raft of recommendations that have been consulted on since April about changes to legislation in dog and cat management. That's proceeding. That consultation is happening as we speak and finished, in fact, on Friday. And this process is happening in parallel with that. But that consultation process didn't include the recommendation on mandatory desexing. So this is a breakout part of the process. It's going a step further than what people thought we should do at the time. But as I said, of the 1,600 submissions, many hundreds said, why don't you go further than this? Consider mandatory desexing. So that's why we've come to this process, to actually delve down through a very intense process of listening to information, weighing it up yourself, as if you were the community of South Australia, and coming to a verdict. Because I believe, and we believe, that you are so representative, we hope, of the community of South Australia, that the process you're going through and the verdict you would come to would be one that the community would accept as well, because they would go through the same sort of thinking process.
My other question is, you explained to us the 10,000 and what numbers we're not getting, which I absolutely 100% agree. Where does that 10,000 come from? What numbers are we getting? Do you understand what
I think we're getting the numbers that come through from our agencies. So the RSPCA, AWL and those that have to unfortunately manage to deal with these pets that are surrendered or that arrive there and they can't rehome.
So is it fair to say that anything outside those numbers is quite dodgy?
Yes.
And could also involve a lot of cruelty towards innocent animals?
Well, we don't know about any of that, but we do know that with local government that we don't keep a record necessarily of those like the agencies do. So we do know that it's happening and they have powers to do it, but they don't keep stringent records like this group do. What happens, and I'll be honest here, I'm a country girl and I know what happens to the cats that turned up, that they ended up unfortunately in a bag. And we've got no understanding of what happens there. So we do know, we are very clear that we can substantiate the 10,000. We know that there's more going on and we know where, but in some of these agencies that have the power to do this, but then, Joe Farmer or whatever, we have no understanding. So it's a lot more than 10,000. That's the point I'm trying to say to you.
Good morning. My question is to Felicity. How would you envisage enforcing the mandatory registration of the desexing of the animals?
Okay, I guess we've talked about how this might play out in a number of ways, but at this point in time we haven't got a firm view about how that might happen. I'll take you back again to the microchipping issue. You can't see if the dog's got a microchip or not from here. You can't see if someone's desexed or not, a dog or a cat's desexed necessarily from here, if you're an animal management officer. So we know that there's going to be some challenges around that, but I think it's one of those things that we know are not an insurmountable challenge for us. It would be around the registration process right from the early on, because we're going to have registration of breeders. Everyone who breeds will have to. Now I know that means that if my dog has puppies and I give them away, I'm not needing to be registered. There's no money changing hands, so it won't capture that group. But I think it's like anything, it's about the change in the culture. Once something becomes normalised, more people do it, and you're only dealing with a very small percentage who, for one reason or another, won't do the victim blaming thing, choose or can't do what it is that we want. So I think, to go back to my point earlier, I think the agencies, like the RSPCA and AWL, who won't be dealing with this massive issue, will have greater amount of resource to be able to support those who are at the pointy end, low SES and other categories of people who might find it more difficult to comply with this. And local government, I hope too, will see opportunities to do that. A bit like the microchipping day. Everyone turns up under a tent, it's done in a fabulous way and it costs $25. And if you can't do that, there's some opportunities perhaps for subsidy from my board or from the agency. So I don't know if it's answered your question, but I think there's some ways that we can do that will make it reasonably easy.
And I can say this is something that you can give us some advice about as well. If, for example, looking ahead, if we do put mandatory sexing in the legislation, there are a number of ways you could do it. One is tomorrow, everybody that hasn't de-sexed their pet has to go off to the vet and get it de-sexed. That's probably a heavy-handed approach. But you might say phase it in. So existing animals, you don't need to go and get them de-sexed if you don't want to. But for new sales, it will apply within 6 months' time, so everybody has time to get prepared for it. But you might also recommend, or councils might say, look, what we'll do is make de-sexed animals half the cost to register. So if you go off and de-sex your animal, you'll pay X, and if you have a non-de-sexed animal, you'll pay twice that amount. So there are ways that we could actually phase it in over time, so there's not a big jolt. There are incentives that could be built in. Councils could come to the party. We know a number of vets already offer discounted de-sexing. Councils could be involved in that as well. So really, we want to hear your views about that, how to make it, if that's your decision, how to make it work.
My question is either or of you. In a situation where you're asking for mandatory de-sexing unless they're registered breeders, is that not going to create a situation whereby there's going to be price gouging? The average family won't be able to afford a dog if only registered breeders who've got pedigree animals, I presume. What happens to the kid who wants them up?
The obvious answer is go to the Animal Welfare League or RSPCA, where you can get an animal for $360 to $400 who is microchipped and de-sexed and vet checked already. That's going to be your cheapest approach. However, as Felicity said, if you do want to have an animal that's not de-sexed because you want to have a litter for whatever reason, and you're giving the animals away, the litter away, that's fine. But what we do need to focus on as well, there are some very unscrupulous people out there who keep dogs in very inhumane conditions to be just litter mums, and just keep pumping out litters time and time again. And these are what we call backyard breeders. They don't have any consideration for the welfare of the animals. They may be selling animals that have disease or genetic flaws, for example, hip dysplasia. And really, if you're in the market of buying an animal, that's not the animal you want to buy. That's why you need to get an animal that is already vet checked or comes from a reputable breeder who doesn't provide those sort of diseased or genetically flawed animals. So these are the thorny issues, but we are already clamping down on puppy farmers, and there will need to be a process of where do you find your animals. But I always get mine from AWL. I always get mine from the RSPCA at Lonsdale, and they come microchipped, de-sexed, and vet checked already, and a very reasonable price.
Look, I think my board has had a big discussion around what will this mean for the moggy. I've got a moggy. She's a tortie, and she was one of those stories, my husband went to work, one of the women at work's sister had a cat that wasn't desexed, and it was a kitten itself. It had its first litter at 4 months or something, and so the staff member was trying to give away. Anyone want a kitten? I'm sure you've all worked in places like that. Who wants a kitten? Whatever. And they make fabulous pets, and she's desexed, and she's all of that because I'm a responsible pet owner. How do we make sure that we continue to have those and that genetic material moving around? So some of those things I think we can address, because if we have a system where you can register as a breeder, even if it's a moggy, it's not a whatever breed, people would still have the opportunity to have exemptions or whatever. So long as we were confident that they weren't the ones like the people sort of further up my street that had turned up with 6 cats, and then about 3 months later there were 20, and it was a nightmare. All of us ended up having another cat from that episode. You might have had similar experiences. So that's what we're trying to address. So it's got to be nuanced. It can't be a blunt instrument. There will be opportunities for shades of grey, I think. That would be my understanding of it.
It strikes me that that the question we're being asked is one that has the potential to run across a lot of different areas, and to impact quite significantly on legislation that you've already got in process and so on. How wide's our purview on all this? If we came up with an idea, for example, if we said, let's make mandatory registration of cats part of the deal, because that's how we feel we can monitor it, and that's not in the legislation at the moment. Perhaps, I don't know. It is right. Well, that's good. Right, but if we came up with something like that,
sure.
Is that beyond our purview? Is it beyond our purview to be saying things like, well, if we're expecting mandatory registration of mandatory desexing of companion animals, then we should have regulated prices for desexing, stuff like that.
I guess you can make those suggestions, but at the end of the day, the veterinary people will be able to say, well, that's not going to work because we can't do it for that price. You might make some recommendations. I think that's perfectly fine. We certainly want to hear that. I think we want to hear all of those suggestions. Certainly we do. Yeah, most definitely.
And I'm not in the business of putting barriers around what you're going to consider and what your recommendations will be, but I'm not going to give you a blank cheque either. In the current legislation as it already exists, councils can put mandatory registration for cats, and some councils do. And this is, and Felicity will tell you as a former mayor, this is a point of extremely hot debate in local communities about mandatory registration for cats. But you can already do it. Councils can already avail themselves of that legislation that already exists. The mandatory part isn't there from a total state position. And my view would be that might be a little step too far. But I'm not going to say to you, don't recommend it to us. That's your considered position. But again, we're looking for outcomes that the community will support. And the process of debate hopefully will be one that reflects the debate in the community as well.
Question over here, I think. You asked me a while ago. I guess my question doesn't directly concern the animals, but it concerns the people who are responsible for carrying out the horrible job of euthanizing the 10,000 plus animals. And is there any statistics around the health outcomes for the people who have to do that, around suicide rates, depression, illness, through the RSPCA, Animal Welfare League, veterinary practices and so on?
I wouldn't pretend to answer that because I have no knowledge of it, but you will be able to invite people from those organisations who I'm sure will be able to talk to you about that experience.
In fact, you're going to hear from Tim and from Richard from AWO and RSPCA next weekend. So you'll be able to drill down on them on that, and they've now got a heads up because they're up the back there, so they'll come prepared, I'm sure. Okay, another question in the middle.
Currently, who pays for the euthanasia of the animals? Is it just the RSPCA and those organisations, or does government contribute to that?
I think it's the RSPCA, Animal Welfare League and councils. Is that right?
Do we contribute anything to that? Yes, and the board.
Which is funded by the government.
Okay, a couple more questions. John?
Thank you. I'm curious as to know if you've got a including feral and semi-owned pets, because government works on money, and at the bottom there has to be this issue. So that's the first question. And the second question arose during your presentation, and that is, who is responsible? We've mentioned here the state, we've got the Dog and Cat Management Board, and you've mentioned councils. And I know that in WA, for instance, the pressure is purely on councils. So could you please explain that for
So
us?
can you just clarify again what you want me to...
Firstly, who is responsible for cost here?
Yeah.
And secondly, who is responsible at the moment for this problem? Is it the local council? Or,
Yeah, that
I
has
don't know, who has...
Fundamentally, the legislation says it's a council's responsibility, but when those animals are handed over to Animal Welfare League or the RSPCA, they become the responsible party. Of course, the state has an interest in this, and as you highlighted, there is a cost in all these issues to society at large. I don't have a figure in my head, but ferals is another issue altogether. Yes, ferals are impacted, of course, by unbridled breeding of cats and dogs that escape into the bush, for example, and you'll probably hear very shortly a program announced by the federal government about feral cats, but that's to be distinguished from this process, really.
Minister, the dogs and cats aren't the responsible parties in this. They're the victims because the owners are not doing it. So should we be looking at licensing people to own pets as a whole rather than just pick on the animals? I mean, continue with the proper euthanasia and all that. It's
Right. Again, that might be a step too far, although I sympathise with your how you think. But at the end of the day, pet owners are the responsible persons. They are. We make them be responsible by registration processes. We make them be responsible to their neighbours and their community. And most pet owners are responsible. Most of us love our pets. And most of us want to do the right thing by them. Sometimes, for no fault of our own, something happens that we can't control, and then we lose our pet or cause some damage to society or the pet itself. And there are some people, regrettably, who have a less than responsible attitude to those pets as well. And then, as I pointed to earlier, there are those breeders and puppy farmers who have no responsible attitudes towards pets and should be stopped from ever having a pet. But again, that's not something that I'm considering at this point in time. What I'm trying to do is get a practical outcome to reduce the number of animals that are surrendered every year and euthanized, and to encourage people to be more responsible with their pets. That's the practical, pragmatic approach I'm looking for.
Okay, any other questions? One more, perhaps, if there's any more. One over here. Yep, this will be the last. Thanks.
I'm just interested because of these steps too far. We, outside of this immediate issue, we're currently as a society looking at measures to tackle climate change and sustainability of resources and all of that sort of thing. Isn't it fair to say that the amount of wildlife, flora and fauna that get destroyed by domestic dogs and cats that are just roaming at their free will during the day is surely some sort of point that can be raised in a debate in terms of educating people about how better to husband their creature.
Absolutely right. Again, I'm not going to constrain you in your deliberations at all. What I'm trying to give you a sense of is what I can conceivably get through a parliamentary process. Again, it's got to be practical and pragmatic, germane to this issue. Yes, you might want to think about licensing individuals to have children as well as own pets, but that's probably not something I'm going to get through Parliament. That's probably not something I'm going to get through Parliament. Absolutely, feral animals have a massive impact on our environment, and that's something that I deal with through my own department in terms of some of our feral animal management programs. A little bit separate from your charge, by all means consider it. It is important because it is the escapees that cause these problems. But come back to, right, how do we have a real and meaningful impact on pushing down on the supply side of unwanted animals? How can we do that meaningfully, practically, which the community at large will support? I don't want a fractious outcome that is going to be something that most community won't support, because frankly there's no point in doing that.
And I can say it, but the Minister can't, but because it's a political construct in which we live. So anything that's not going to be politically palatable is not going to be one that his colleagues are going to embrace. So I think, whilst, that can't be constraining of you in your thinking, I think we've got to be realistic enough to know we live in a representational democracy structure, and so to try and think that, you put something up that was completely out there and nobody was going to support is probably, whilst it might be an interesting process, probably not going to be particularly useful in a practical sense. But I'll come back to the issue just to reassure you that my board is already very aware of the interface here with the feral animals, and the NRM boards and my board are spending a bit more time and going to, when we hopefully can get this agenda sorted, we are already looking at how we can do more to support the NRM boards, but we will, I think, I'm probably speaking a bit out of turn here, but I think our view is that when we get a few things off our plate with this legislation and what it will fix up for us, and then perhaps your deliberations might help us even more, there will be an opportunity, a space for the board to start doing research and looking at, some of these other issues that perhaps are not so central to management, because ours is a management issue. Some of it might be about welfare, and you sort of get into that murky part, but there is certainly discussion at my board meetings about the fact that we're aware that this issue is kind of a floater out there, and we have to start exercising our minds about it a bit more as well. So just to put your mind at ease there.
And again, just to give you some comfort, Kangaroo Island community, for example, is now currently discussing amongst itself whether they should be banning cats and a mandatory desexing process on Kangaroo Island. And the community, I understand, are largely supportive of that. And also councils in the Riverland are now discussing together with the government what can we do about the feral cat problem in our area. So those things are happening. They're happening through the NRM boards and others and other agencies, and I hinted the federal government will shortly be announcing something along feral cats as well. But to come back to your dog and cat management approach, the real concern for me is 10,000 dogs and cats, companion animals, or more, possibly more, probably more, are euthanised every year. What can we do in the short term to put downward pressure on the number of cats and dogs that are killed every year because they can't find homes?
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Felicity, for speaking to us today. So, thank you.